That was audio from the Newsroom on HBO, a fictionalized interview with a climate scientist and EPA official. I'm speaking with a real climate scientist, Dr. Michael Mann. That was troubling. Catastrophic failure of the planet. House already burned to the ground. It's hopeless. What do you think, Michael Mann? Is that true?
Well, no, it's a caricature of the actual science and the actual evidence. And, this is a fictional account, and I think that it was an attempt at parody. At least that's my interpretation, because it's, somewhat absurd, for example, to even refer to catastrophic failure of the planet. Scientifically, I don't know what that means. Now, we do talk about prospects for dangerous climate change. And it is true that if we don't do something about our escalating carbon emissions within the next few years, then we are going to commit to what could reasonably be described as increasingly dangerous and potentially irreversible changes in our climate. But it's very unlikely we'll see anything along the lines of what the scientist in the fictional account refers to. We will see some bad stuff. If we don't do something about this problem, then we will see increasingly negative impacts. We're already seeing negative impacts on our life. But it's not worth exaggerating either the nature of those impacts or the extent to which we are already committed to them. And I think the piece does somewhat of a disservice by implying that we have already baked that there's nothing that we can do to stem the tide, to prevent meters of sea level rise, to prevent increasingly widespread drought, to prevent the sorts of catastrophic outcomes that are described in the piece. There is still time to do that, and that's what hopefully is going to happen over the next few years. And this is a critical juncture right now as we go into a year from the Paris summit, the Paris UN summit, which is probably the next opportunity for meaningful international progress in doing something, again, about our escalating carbon emissions.
Well, and I want to get to that in a moment, and also the Lima, Peru climate summit, which is
right now.
Yeah. But I want to press you on this point a little bit because, I hear certain things from scientists, and James West, I think, over at Mother Jones, sort of fact-checked what this fictional character was saying. The last time there was this much CO2 in the air, the oceans were 80 feet higher than they are now. And I recall seeing on Showtime's documentary series that I think you worked on, Year of Living Dangerously.
Right.
I believe it was an interview from that where you had a scientist saying if we don't get to zero emissions by the end of the century, we're in big trouble. That we have to cut 70% emissions by the middle of this century. Are those numbers true? And what if we don't do those things? So, in other words, a difference between what I'm hearing from the scientists and then what I'm hearing from people saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. We have time. We can fix this."
Yeah, we don't have a whole lot of time to prevent dangerous interference with the climate. And by some, in some respects, we're already seeing dangerous impacts of climate change here in the U.S., increasingly worse wildfires out west, more widespread droughts, record heat waves, record flooding events, and, events like Hurricane Sandy, which were certainly made worse by human-caused climate change. We are already seeing negative impacts of climate change, so we don't have to speculate about whether that's possible. It's already happening. The question is, how bad are we willing to let it go? Now, we're very unlikely to see 80 feet of sea level rise, even though it is technically true that the last time we are certain that CO2 levels were as high as they are today was probably several million years ago, and sea level was indeed 80 feet higher. That's primarily because CO2 was sustained at those very high levels for millennia, and we are not yet committed to sustaining CO2 levels at anything close to what they were back then for millennia. There's still time to stabilize CO2, to decrease our emissions so that we, for example, do not exceed 450 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. And we estimate that that is a level of CO2 where we are likely to lock in about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet relative to pre-industrial time, and that 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius warming is often used as a metric of when we enter into truly dangerous interference with the climate system. We're not committed to that yet, and we're not committed to the most profound and negative impacts of climate change yet. But there isn't a lot of time. If we're going to prevent CO2 from crossing 450 ppm,
parts per million,
parts per million, then it is necessary to make the sorts of cuts that you allude to, something akin to a 70% reduction of CO2 emissions relative to late 20th century levels by the middle of the century. Now, if you look at the commitment that was made in this latest agreement between the U.S. and China, the U.S. there committed to lower its carbon emissions by about 26 to 28% relative to 2005 levels by 2025 in a decade. And China, which of course is industrializing and doesn't have the legacy that we have of several centuries of fossil fuel burning, is in a different position, but they have committed to bring their emissions to a peak, which will be critical if we're going to avoid crossing that 450 parts per million limit, bringing their emissions to a peak by 2030. So what you have are the two largest emitters on the planet, both with very different histories of carbon emissions, but the two largest current emitters on the planet, China and the U.S., coming to an agreement that sort of sets the stage for what we might hope will happen next year in Paris for a truly global treaty with all of the major industrial nations and the developing world making actionable and mandatory cuts.
And so,
carbon emissions.
So I'm glad to hear that you feel all of this is possible. Maybe I've become over time less optimistic, and of course I'll say something to you, Dr. Michael Mann, that I'm sure a few people say. Whoa, you've made me feel better. Thank you. I guess you don't hear that a lot. I do get concerned, though, because I hear that one thing from scientists that sound very alarming, and then I hear other scientists saying there's still time. Rajendra Prachari, the head of the UN climate, I guess the IPCC, saying that we still have time. We can do something about that. Yeah. But that seems counter to the actual numbers that I'm hearing. So I'm going to take you at your word that we can get out of this mess if we take action. I'm still very concerned.
The